Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm Vanessa Cardamone, Climate Analysis Advisor at ACAPS, and I will be facilitating today's session about climate data and analysis gaps, needs, and solutions, very important solutions for the humanitarian sector. Thank you for coming, and I know there is a very interesting session next door so thank you for prioritizing this one. I'm here today with Jennifer Mbwama. I think Jennifer, please, so you can put your camera on if you're here with us. Hi, Jennifer, the RR and Climate Policy and Development Lead at Humanity and Inclusion. Jeremy Wetterbo, Senior Advisor Climate, Environment and Migration at Impact. Leah Kripsenia, Senior Humanitarian Program Manager at Internews. And Celso Dulce, also joining us online, Integrated Risk Management Director at CARE Philippines. Thank you for joining us. We planned this session to be interactive. We have a few questions for participants through Mentimeter. And I was really impressed by the diversity of participants' background today, so I think it'd be very good if you can write your questions, comments, and experiences in the chat for those joining online, and please here in the room, feel free to intervene. There'll be some time at the end for questions and comments. So we know that the access to lack of access to climate data and information is often mentioned by humanitarian actors as one of the main challenges, preventing them from scaling up response in climate change affected settings, but also preventing them from supporting adaptations. Finding adaptation solutions. These are two key commitments of the Humanitarian Charter. At ACAPS, we piloted last year a number of different climate analysis products, ranging from, I think, yes, we can. I will not present the slide, but you can access our main climate analysis page through the QR code. Our products were ranging from localized vulnerability and exposures analysis at the subnational level to seasonal and medium-range climate anticipatory analysis like the El Niño outlooks that we published in 2023 and early this year. But we believe that there is a role that information analysis providers like us can play to better support the advancement of climate change adaptation agenda, to better support humanitarian actors in implementing climate risk-informed programming. So we'd like today to understand and I will be supported by our panelists and by you participants today in understanding what are the actual gaps, needs, and how we can better address them. Jennifer will share some insights about how we can better capture the differential vulnerabilities and exposures to climate hazards based on factors like disability, gender, age. How can we better capture them? How can we better address them? Jeremy will present some of the work being conducted by Impact around climate and environmental analysis, and probably share a little bit with us how they're responding to the gaps that they have identified. Leah will share some insights about the work being conducted by Internews around the local information environments in climate change affected settings. Internews has recently published a brilliant report called Silent Crisis, which will be presented tomorrow at 2 p.m. This report really investigates the local challenges, opportunities around information, climate change information, based on two case studies from Iraq and Zimbabwe. And Celso has extensive experience in involving and working with local actors in disaster risk management, so it will give us some local perspectives regarding what are the main gaps, needs, and challenges local actors face in implementing climate risk informed programming. So now we're going to start with the first questions for the audience. So question being, what are the main information and data gaps that prevent humanitarian actors from implementing climate risk-informed programming? We know that there is a gap. We have been exchanging with actors. We know that there are gaps. Can we please be more specific? Can you please tell us, according to you, what are the specific gaps? I think we can show the Mentimeter. Yeah, so you can join the Mentimeter poll through your mobile, either scan, for those joining online, the QR code, or just add the code 1241-91-6. And we'll take a few minutes to let colleagues write their answers. Please try to be specific, use keywords. This will be better captured by, I think we'll display the answers through word cloud. And then based on your feedback, each one of the panelists will share their answer to this question. Okay, coordination, integration, actionability. We had a very interesting internal discussion yesterday at ACAPS, how we can better link analysis to decision making, how we can better contribute to decision making. That's probably the biggest question for all information analysis providers. Okay. Local information, I see coordination, communication, standardization. Can we zoom in a little bit, please? Yeah, exposure. Now exposure comes vulnerability. Yeah. Interesting, a lot of diverse answers. Data silos, yes. Little issue we face. I think we have 45 responses, we'll take one more minute for those who haven't applied yet. Yeah, it's like easier to read it here. Yeah, I can see some participants mention need for technical expertise. Do not know where to find information. This is something that we noticed at ACAPS when we started working on climate analysis, that there is data and information available for some context, not always at the subnational level, but at least at the national level. But this is very technical. It is often hard for humanitarian actors working in emergency or in a protracted crisis to take the time to have the technical skills to go through very, very technical, detailed, scientific papers. So there is really a need to bridge a little bit the gap between the scientific sector and the humanitarian one. Okay, I still see a few answers, but I believe we can start with the first round of contributions from panelists. So the first question is for Jeremy. Please, Jeremy.
You could just get the slides. The remote. This one.
Ah, yes, sorry.
So yeah, just quickly looking at the slide, at the feedback. Thanks a lot. I'm basically going to talk about exposure and vulnerability, which were the two words that came out.
Perfect. Yeah.
ACAPS and all the fellow panelists for inviting me today. It's a real pleasure to share some of our work. And really, my intervention is going to focus on one key objective, on how do we translate the ever-increasing amount of climate and environmental data to local level action. And I do have to emphasize the environment piece of this because we're really looking at a climate and environmental crisis. So if we look at some of the global frameworks that can help us unpack the session's topic, I really wanted to share this nice graph from the colleagues at UNFCCC that was released in 2017 that really looked how at the intersection of climate change adaptation, disaster risk reduction, sustainable development, there's this concept of reducing vulnerability and enhancing resilience. And one might also add some of the objectives from the recently agreed Kunming-Montréal Accords on biodiversity, where Target 8 is very much about also reducing vulnerability and increasing resilience. Now, if you look at the flip side of vulnerability and resilience, you'll start quickly talking about risk management, or how do we make decisions today that will reduce the impacts of risks to come. Now, I don't need to dwell on the fact that risks are coming. Actually, to be more accurate, risks have already significantly increased and will continue to increase until we collectively get a handle on our greenhouse gas emissions levels. There's a fantastic 3,600-page report from the IPCC that dwells into that if you want more details. But we need to collectively better understand these risks to make better decisions. And this very much applies whether you're a development, humanitarian, peace, or humanitarian actor. And I found an intervention the other day from some of the BRAC colleagues that the complexity of what we're trying to achieve is that we're actually working with degrading baselines. For every ton of CO2 equivalent that we continue emitting in the atmosphere, well, our risks are going to continue to increase, right? Now try to have that chat with your insurance broker. You know, my driving skills are going to deteriorate, so please sell me insurance. You can't price that. It's very difficult. And so when you're looking, and so while we see a lot of communications and political commitments on keeping 1.5 degrees within reach, our current policies and actions are actually taking us towards 2.7 degrees of warming, right? And so unfortunately, in all climate and environment talks, you have to kind of start with the bad news. But now the good news is that we've become quite good at understanding risks. And that's because we've been saying for quite some time that it's important. So I have a few UNDR colleagues here, but in 2005, the Hyogo framework for action from the DRR sector was already saying it's very important to understand risks. And 5 priorities of that framework was very much about risk knowledge generation and, very importantly, risk communication, right? In 2015, we packaged this into one priority called understanding disaster risks. And I must admit, I read a lot of those framework documents, the clarity of that objective, understanding disaster risks, is really refreshing, right? So we've known for quite some time what we need to know. We need to understand risks. And most of you have probably seen this graph or a derivative of this graph that shows that in order to understand risks, we need to understand hazard, vulnerability, and exposure. And so great that this came out in some of the keywords. And so the reality is that at the global level, we've become quite good at measuring and modeling a lot of hazards. Floods, droughts, extreme heat, extreme cold, wildfire, sea level, glacier melt. These are only few of the 800 plus hazards that the UNDRR Hazard Definition and Classification Review has identified. And some of them are compounded by climate change, some of them are not, right? And it's very important to, when we think of climate and environment, to look at integrated risk management. This speaks a lot to the DRR community, maybe less so to the climate community, right? We've also become quite good at understanding exposure, whether you're looking at population, land use data, everything's pretty much available at the global level and can be used to understand how assets or people are exposed to those said hazards, right? What's not widely available is, and especially in crisis context, is the vulnerability data. To what extent the underlying vulnerability increase really make some people more vulnerable to those shocks, right? And whether you're looking for population, infrastructure, or land vulnerability data, this type of information is not widely available. And the trick to crack this equation is to do this, we have to do this analysis as well at several levels, right? We have to look at this at the global, national level. And so here I just wanted to share with you a few examples. These are by no extent comprehensive. These are the ones I use. There's there's a lot of data on that. But basically, if you have to identify in which countries should I do climate change adaptation programs, you can use the JRC Climate Change Informed one, right? So we're able to make that decision, right? If you're looking at subnational prioritization, I use the JFDR, that's our World Bank colleagues, in terms of looking what hazard, which geography. You can look at admin one and try to prioritize that. And increasingly at the local level, you're starting to have very localized risk data available, especially through Earth observation. And again, an example from the World Bank on flood risks, right? And so, looking at decisions and what we need to make as collectively as decisions, as I was saying, going from global to national, you can be done. There's a few examples here. From national to subnational, okay, to some extent. From subnational to local, and what do you do at the local level? This lacks drastically, right? And this is especially, most relevant in fragile and crisis-affected contexts. I've seen a lot of great work from UN Habitat, I think it was in Vietnam or Indonesia, but there's not such data in the Burkinas, Malis, or Niger of the world, unfortunately. And so, really going back to our objective of translating this ever-increasing data to local level action, we see that we have a wide array of knowledge that allows us to prioritize decisions in crisis contexts, right? But this lack of data in the most vulnerable is a key issue. And why it's a key issue? Because from one side, these are the areas that generally have least contributed to the problem. B, they are most exposed to this kind of triple conflict, climate, humanitarian crisis, and shocks in general. And C, they have much less adaptive capacity to deal with these shocks, right? And so really to answer the question on what is the main information gap we're seeing, at the moment, it's very much on this lack of data at local level, especially in the world's most vulnerable countries. Hope that was clear enough.
Yes, it was. Thank you so much, Jeremy. Leah.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to talk about, I think, a quite related point, but sort of point coming at a different direction. So, when we think about what are the gaps for humanitarians, I think we at Internews and through the sort of programmatic work that we do on information, as well as this recent research, one of the gaps for humanitarians is actually from the bottom up, right? That community information is also a gap for ourselves, and that really requires a shift in thinking that I think many of us are already doing, but that we want to really continue to push in thinking of ourselves not just as information providers or producers or analyzers, but also as recipients of information from community levels. And so we talk a lot about two-way communication, and even that is sort of overly simplistic because we really want to think about it as sort of information cycles. We need to understand as humanitarians what information communities have, what information they need, but to let that become a part of an agenda setting process. So when we think about sort of listening to communities, understanding community feedback, it's not sort of saying, okay, great, you need information on adaptation for smallholder farmers. It's about supporting that agenda setting and in a sort of active process. So that brings us to, I think, what really, again, has continually come out of the work that Internews does, is that we need to then consider localized information ecosystems, which unfortunately is a little bit more complicated to consider than just sort of constructing messages and thinking about it. But we need to look at the full information ecosystem that people in frontline communities are within, because it's a question of what. You can ask people what information they need, and they often have actually quite clear and specific responses to that question. Some of the communities we worked with in Iraq on this research said that, look, if we have access to enough water, we have information about what to do with it. So they needed a very specific set of information around how to access more water and how to adapt in a certain sense, and then they didn't need information on changes in farming techniques. So that's a very specific thing, but that's one point in time. That gives us one data point. We can look to provide that information, but that doesn't tell us the how, how they want to receive that information. What are the existing channels that people use, that people trust and don't trust? Where are the gaps? And as humanitarians, I think we sometimes come in and we see we have a place in the information ecosystem, but we're not necessarily always sufficiently good at gathering a broader understanding of what that ecosystem looks like. The other point that I would make on this, unfortunately, to complicate it even further, is this question of trust, right? It's such an important point, and not just are we trusted and why are we trusted, but that really local nuance on levels of trust and understanding where that comes from. So, we see a lot of mistrust, particularly in communities that have been marginalized for a long time, particularly in communities that do have, I think, quite a solid understanding of the fact that they are the recipients of the climate crisis and not the causers of the climate crisis. But that trust it's so nuanced. One of the things that our research found is in Zimbabwe, the Zimbabwe National Water Association is not trusted when it comes to information about why there's water scarcity, because that seemed to be potentially politicized, potentially captured by various interests. They are trusted when it comes to specific techniques for how to adapt to water scarcity. So that level of nuance, it's not just, is this institution trusted? It's not just, is this institution trusted to speak about the specific issue of water scarcity? It's at even a more granular level of trust that people are making these decisions about what information they're seeking, what information they choose to trust when they find it. And so one of the things that we find is that really investing in that understanding in how communities are engaging in their information ecosystems will fill in one of those gaps that we have. So, my colleagues are talking about the sort of gaps in our own analysis and pulling in this information and transmitting it, but if we don't sort of include that reverse gap of our understanding of communities, then we might not be packaging or producing the exact kind of information that's really going to be helpful.
Thank you very much, Leah. So yes, looking at communities and local actors, not only as recipient of information, but generating information and analysis with them. Thank you. Celso, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning. Good morning to you. It's afternoon here in the Philippines, and extremely warm greetings from our country. We are in the midst of an El Nino triggered drought, so it's a bit, it's quite warm here in the Philippines. Now, I'm hearing lack of data at the local level, especially amongst the most vulnerable populations. I'm hearing lack of data, bottom-up data. I'm hearing the question of trust in terms of generating data. And this really resonates well with our experience here in the Philippines. And let me add that one of the key issues that we are facing is the availability of timely data, of timely information to serve as basis for sound life-saving decisions, they remain a challenge for us humanitarian actors. Addressing this challenge becomes more pressing in light of the level of unpredictability of some extreme weather events. For example, it is only now that the country is hearing about the increasing frequency of tropical cyclones going into rapid or explosive intensification. A decade ago, we were not hearing anything about this. So what is rapid or explosive intensification? It's simply tropical cyclone that has been forecasted as very weak, or it's not even a tropical cyclone, but within 24 hours, it intensifies into a Category 5 typhoon. What is the implication of this? This means that there is very little lead time for everyone to prepare for the event, much less to activate anticipatory action. There is a gap in terms of availability of data to inform decisions and actions when we needed them most. I think I would have to underline that, when we needed them most. When life-saving decisions need to be taken within the first 24 hours, the first 48, the first 78-hour timeframes, adequate information is simply not there. It's still not there. Hence, we frequently find ourselves in a situation where information at the national level would not, at that moment, justify urgent action or decision, such as making resources available to finance humanitarian actions. We hear pronouncements such as the caseload is not that huge enough and the government has the capacity to deal with the situation. Imagine the implications of those pronouncements on populations affected by crisis. After 1 to 3 weeks, the usual national sources of information would eventually have a more complete assessment of the situation. This, however, is way past the time information is needed most. Just 2 days ago, the Care-Led Access project, which is being funded by ECHO, organized a forum to discuss exactly these topics, the trends in the country's humanitarian context, challenges, and lessons from practice. Having adequate and timely information to inform decisions has been one of the challenges identified by participants coming from national NGOs, international NGOs, and UN organizations. A number of barriers to adequate and timely information have also been identified. Safety and security, and especially this is true at the local level, and when different risks are intersecting. Imagine flood or typhoon affected communities that are also suffering from chronic conflict. So lack of technical and financial capacity at different administrative levels of government has also been identified. And lack of coordination are just the few of the barriers identified. The participants to the forum have agreed to regularize the discussion in order to find practical solutions to the issues identified. And we are very much willing to share further information when these activities do happen, and we plan to do it quarterly. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Celso. Jennifer.
Hi, everyone.
Hello.
So thanks very much for inviting me to join this conversation. And sorry I can't be here with you in person today. So I work for Humanitarian Inclusion, which is an organization that has placed inclusion at the heart of its mandate. It's in the name of the organization. So it's really a guiding principle that really drives our actions across our many intervention sectors, including disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. So when it comes to dealing with the humanitarian impacts of climate change, especially climate extremes and disasters, which is the area I focus on, our perspective and some of the key questions that we ask ourselves is who are the most vulnerable, who are the most at risk, how can we better identify those marginalized people who might fall through the cracks of humanitarian aid while being potentially disproportionately affected by escalating climate impacts. And part of the answer to that, I would say, is data disaggregation. So really breaking down any sets of quantitative or qualitative data into specific subgroups to better identify and address specific climate vulnerabilities and needs. I remember from the Mentimeter that some people mentioned vulnerability. So I think we are addressing this. At HI, we've actually been long-time advocates for data disaggregation by disability, gender, and age to enable more inclusive and accessible humanitarian responses, really acknowledging that persons with disability tend to be overlooked in humanitarian programming and also tend to experience the impacts of climate change more intensely than others. This has been observed on the ground and it's been documented. We know, for instance, that persons with disability are most likely to die or to be injured in disaster situations, that they are likely to face more difficulties to recover from climate shocks and stresses, and that generally speaking, they are exposed to heightened risks in humanitarian settings due to pre-existing vulnerabilities. So data disaggregation by disability, gender, and age is really a critical way of working to make sure that climate risk-informed programming leaves no one behind. And we've seen great progress in recent years in terms of disaggregating data from the humanitarian community. Tools and methodologies have been developed to support these efforts. We can mention, for instance, the UN-approved Washington Group questions, which helps collect comparable disability data, for instance. But it's still not systematically implemented at scale. And for instance, HI is currently implementing an inclusive anticipatory action program. And as part of this program, we carried out a short survey last year with a sample of humanitarian actors engaged in anticipatory action. And 92% of respondents considered that they do not sufficiently capture the needs of persons with disabilities in their climate risks assessments. While they are meant to consider the climate vulnerabilities of relevant groups in a given community. And also 48% were not aware of the Washington Group questions to collect disability data. So the challenges that are commonly shared and reported by practitioners we work with usually include technical barriers. There is this perception of complexity when it comes to disaggregating data that prevents implementation. Challenges also range from logistical and financial to operational barriers. And another limitation that we observe is that when disaggregated data is actually collected, it is generally not done in a harmonized fashion across stakeholders, which really limits the availability and the use of comparable and high quality data across locations. So it doesn't really help to shine a light on large scale hidden trends for specific groups in terms of climate vulnerabilities, risks, impacts, and needs, of course. And we also note that when we interact with partners, that oftentimes there is also limited capacity for data analysis. So the data ends up not really being used to actually inform action. And I mean, us as humanitarians, sometimes we have a tendency to over-collect data about the communities we support, including information that sometimes we don't need. So I think there's also this challenge of clarifying what is the key usable information that we need about local vulnerabilities. So all in all, just to go back to the original question, I would say that increased progress and efforts are observed across the board in terms of disaggregating data. But generally speaking, I would say that it remains a missing information, both in quantity and in quality, that prevents reaching impact at scale. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Thank you all. I think we can take a few first round of questions. We can start with the room, with the audience. Any questions or comments about this first discussion point? Please.
Good morning, my name is Alison Hall. I'm the founder of a small NGO working at the community level in northern Uganda. And I've got a question of sort of two halves. So my first question is, how do you define local? Because everyone talks about localization, but what is it? So that's question number one. And question number two is, we collect this data and we geolocate the most vulnerable people in villages, the elderly, the young, the disabled. But what do I do with that data? I don't know where to take it because we're too small for the big players to want it. So, and nobody actually operates in the villages that we do. So the data's there, and I can tell you hut by hut where they are, but what do I do with it?
Thank you very much for your questions. Perhaps the first one, Leah, would you like to attempt an answer, and Jeremy the second? Yeah.
Sure. Well, to be clear, I don't have an answer to the first question, but I think it is a really important one, and certainly, you know, from our perspective, I talk a lot about localized information ecosystems, but the local piece is really the people, and the information is actually quite complex, right? And interacts with each other, and you know, we see in places where social media is used, that information can be quite global, but not only global. So you might see something on social media and then tell your sister in person, right? And that gets passed around in person. So I think, unfortunately, the category of local is, I think, one that we emphasize so much because we don't want to stay at the national or global level with information, but it's not at all a simplistic category. And I think for us, thinking about information, you know, when you're thinking about it from the perspective of a community, or rather a set of individuals within that community, and certainly speaking to what Jennifer talked about, sort of understanding the complexities of social dynamics and vulnerabilities within that community, each person engages with that ecosystem in different ways. And so what we found in our research is that people wanted not necessarily local information, they wanted actionable information. And so where that information comes from, I think, is a really wide range. But I guess for me, the importance of that local piece is that it's that agenda setting, that we want to do the agenda setting at as local of a perspective as possible, because the people that are making those decisions are at that point. But it's unfortunately not so simple. So I don't think I've answered your question at all, but I'm more acknowledging that I think it's a really important question and point for us to continue to interrogate and continue to be really clear about. So this is something that I'm sure I do as well, but we can toss around these words, local, national, regional, subnational, and instead maybe we can all try to be a little bit more specific about what actually in this specific point are we talking about, and what are the ways that we're understanding those different levels, because I think without that, it can really get elided between different conversations.
Thank you very much. Jeremy, your thoughts on?
Yeah, thanks. I'll just allow myself to quickly comment on the definition of local, because we've put it at scale. We've done a lot of what we call local research in I think more than 20 countries, in crisis-affected countries, from really Ukraine to Burkina Faso, right? And so what we've seen is that in some instances, we've taken local as formal administrative structures, your most local level of governance. It's sometimes been useful, it's sometimes been less useful. Sometimes we have to go below the lowest levels of governance. For example, if you're talking about informal sites in peri-urban areas, who actually makes decisions to reinforce the resilience, reduce the vulnerability, reinforce the resilience of people in informal sites in peri-urban areas? Is it UNHCR? Is it the camp management? Is it the local authority? And this links directly to your second question, that the trick is to try and identify who can actually do something about it. And I think this links to your point that if you identify, let's say, a displaced community that's extremely vulnerable to extreme heat, like we've seen in the Sahel in the month of April, who can do something about it? And if it's UNHCR, well, you know, work on a geography that works to enable action in that geography. If it's a local authority working more on shock-responsive social safety nets, then work with the Ministry of Social Protection, if I've worked with the formal governance structures. So unfortunately, it's one of those boring panel responses that it depends on context, right? Yeah, and I think it answers the question on actioning it, right? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Perhaps we can take one or two questions from the audience.
Not a question, but I have an interesting comment here from SM Mayer. Thank you, SM, who says that the spatial resolution of public data, especially for floods, is very less in least developed countries, and in many cases could not therefore be used to design practical measures. Despite the expansion of the global data set, focus should also be applied to its resolution and its applicability.
Yeah, that's true. A resolution data, resolution of special data can be unique.
Yeah, sure. So if there's any geospatial analysts in the room, the kind of downscaling of geospatial data is a big priority, and I think at the policy level, whether you're looking at what the European Union is doing through JRC, what NASA is doing, like policy makers and researchers are aware that this is a big priority. And I know that I think the JRC is working on scarcer resolution for their global flood awareness system model, which kind of helps you better understand flood risks. And I think I'm just going to comment a bit on how we've used it in a context where we were able to get a flood prediction within 5 or 6 days with a resolution of about 1 kilometer. That was good enough for us because we were able to identify that city will be affected. Whether it's going to be that specific neighborhood, we didn't care. What was very important is to try to work with the local authorities to work on, hey, floods are coming, right? And I think it really depends on what you're trying to do. If you're trying to do preparedness, the resolutions we have are good enough. Then if you're going to do like land use planning, zone, like urban development, etc., then you need to go in much more coarser resolutions, right? So it depends on the purpose. God, I have only these kind of context-specific responses.
Thank you very much. Any other questions or comments from the audience? We have two, please.
Thank you, really interesting presentations, and I'm learning a lot. There's been, I guess, a lot of conversation around the sort of extreme weather side of climate change, and I wondered if the panelists might comment on, I guess, the broader and maybe indirect impacts of climate change on things like water scarcity and how that interacts with conflict and so on. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Please. Yes. I'll take the two questions and then we'll...
Oh, sorry, I was waiting for that answer. I'm very interested.
No, we'll take...
Okay, so my question is probably, we could make it a little bit more related. One of the concerns I've seen, I'm working with the Global Shelter Cluster on environmental issues. One of the issues that we've seen is essentially too much data being provided and the people who we were talking to in the field not understanding or being overwhelmed by the data and then just discounting the information by saying it's not relevant to the problem that we have today. So I was interested in the perspective, I think it was Jeremy just spoke a bit about getting the information you need for the problem that you're trying to address, but it's kind of like an impression across the panel about where do you stop in using data to basically bury every opposition to the kinds of things you want to do, because that's sometimes the way it's seen. And how do you communicate the key points that people need to do without trying to just overwhelm them with all this terrible future that they might be experiencing? Thanks.
Thank you very much. Celso, would you like to comment and answer the two comments and questions from the audience?
Yes, thank you. I'd like to comment on the question about the intersection of extreme climate events, and I would like to relate a very perfect real example from our experience. Some time ago last year, I think it was middle of the year, when we experienced this what was described as a rapid tropical cyclone that rapidly intensified. It was a very weak typhoon, and within 24 hours, it became what we call a super typhoon, a Category 5 typhoon. And we responded to the situation by activating our rapid response mechanism. We have this rapid response mechanism protocols where we are able to mobilize immediately, quickly, resources to respond to the urgent life-saving needs of affected communities. And um, while we were responding to the situation, another super typhoon came. So at one stage, we have to stop our operations because it was simply impossible to operate when there's so much strong winds and so much flooding in our operational areas. Anyway, after that, when we resumed operations, we were already considering the impacts of a forecasted El Nino phenomenon, El Nino episode, because even at that time, information is already available about El Nino, and El Nino for us means drought, dry spell, basically a lack of abnormally low level of rainfall, of precipitation over a long period of time. So we were thinking that um, as these typhoon affected populations will be trying to recover from the typhoon, from the super typhoon, they will be faced with a new emergency, a drought episode, and it is actually happening now. And in that area where we implemented the typhoon response, it is now one of the areas where the drought episode is forecast to last for 8 months. So the endless cycle of extreme weather events has prevented the affected population, the most vulnerable populations, to recover, and we are in this situation where we are grasping at how do we respond to this situation. And to add another layer to that is that these areas are also, although they are not as conflict affected as in the southern part of the country, some of the areas in the northern part of the country is also affected. So this is the situation in an endless cycle of extreme weather events plus other crises, plus other risks like chronic conflict. How do we respond to the situation, both at the short term and in the longer term? So for me, there is no perfect answer. We are still trying to find solutions with that. But the main idea is that we need to consider situations where risks are intersecting, risks are compounding, and it is not sufficient to look at specific hazard events. Over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. This is a very interesting point, how in context affected by multiple risks, or in context where we do see multiple shocks during the same season, we can observe, and this makes the complexity of analysis, that vulnerabilities evolve. The coping capacities, the variables contributing to coping capacities of the community are multiple, and it's very difficult to capture them because they change across time. So it's very interesting point, the one you raised, Celso. Thank you very much. I think we can launch the second question for the audience. You can access it here, and we can perhaps show the QR code too. Yes. So how can we make climate analysis more accessible and actionable to humanitarian actors? So accessibility, actionability were 2 points mentioned before appearing in the first word cloud. So here we'd like to hear from you some suggestions. How can we address these issues? In part, I mentioned that before, we see a need to bridge a little bit the humanitarian and the scientific sectors, connect them, ensuring that we speak the same language. Sometimes it doesn't feel like we speak the same language and we understand each other, but it's more than that, so please. Into ACAPS, early warning. Yeah. The so what of the analysis, what I do with that. Yeah. Yeah. Some answers are related to where to find information. It's true that there is huge list of places, sources where we can find information about the hazards, and then different places where we can find information more about the exposures. Vulnerability is very difficult to get them at once. We have multiplication of sources, and very difficult to access. Jargon, yes, the language often is not always accessible. Simplicity, make that simple. Yeah, that's an important point. And the challenge is how we can. This is something that we've seen when we were working on El Niño outlooks, how to represent in one page, in a diagram, in a map, information coming from multiple seasonal forecast sources, plus information about pre-existing crises and vulnerabilities in the affected areas. A lot of people mentioned early warning, so link information to early warning for all. Okay. As we have still more people answering, we can start first round of answers from our panelists. So please, Leah.
Yes, super interesting to see the answers from the audience. I'm going to sort of go back to what I was talking about in that first point around information ecosystems and really what that means for communities. So again, to me, that's such an important piece about where humanitarian actors need to get information. We need to really understand the information ecosystems of which we are a part, but that we're only one part of. And again, unfortunately, I think what that means is that interventions really need to address that ecosystem as a whole. And I think, on the one hand, that can mean that those interventions are a little bit more complicated than what we think of around sort of social behavior change models. On the other hand, I think the advantage to that is what that gives us is also a little bit more of a sustainable model. So the idea is that if we put ourselves not only in the position of information provider, information analyzer, information processor, that we become a part of that ecosystem and think about that as a healthy information ecosystems are sustainable information ecosystems, that there are actors within that can carry on either after us or without us or in collaboration with us, that it's almost removing ourselves from the center of that equation, which I know for humanitarians it's often very difficult for us to do, but that approach is a more holistic way as well as a more sustainable way to look at communities at the end of the day getting the information that they need. And I actually think it speaks to your point around the more slow onset crises and that sort of ongoing medium to long-term information needs as well. That is not just sort of about what do people need now, but what are the mechanisms that mean that people can access the information that they need over time. I think, you know, one other point that I always want to make is that I think as humanitarians, we need to consider local media, and they're often a stakeholder that we get a little nervous about engaging with for a variety of reasons, many of them good reasons, but that they play a really key role in terms of existing and often quite trusted channels and platforms of information for community members. And if we think around collaboration, potential collaborations with local media, which sometimes means working with what we might call non-traditional partners, which sometimes means working a little bit more across that sort of humanitarian development spectrum, that's a really key stakeholder that plays a role providing analysis to communities, that can provide analysis to us, that can play that role of two-way communication with communities, that agenda-setting piece, but in a way that then doesn't put all of the onus on us to just be providing information. So that's that sort of ecosystem piece. And then lastly, I'll just make sort of two final points that has sort of come out of our research and our ongoing work. And one is that one of the things that we really found is that, you know, there's a lot of hopelessness about climate change and climate impacts, and I think we've probably all had that feeling ourselves. And I think particularly for frontline communities who again are sort of aware that they're bearing the brunt of this and not really the cause of these changes that other people on the panel have talked about. But information is one way that people can feel as though they have some of that agency back. And so working with, you know, the way that people are engaging in information production themselves is one thing that we found that addresses some of those senses of hopelessness, as well as, you know, people basically not feeling like they're continually asking the same questions and not actually getting the answers that they need. But then there's a virtuous cycle there, that then people become more engaged in trying to produce their own information, seeking out the information that they need. And I think that that's something that we want to consider as well. It's a little bit of sort of this psychosocial aspect. And then the last thing I'll say, and this is, you know, I think something I'm saying to myself as Internews, we're in the information game, but then also to those of us that are working on the more resource side of things, is that we also can't divorce that information piece from the resources that people need to particularly on the adaptation side. So there's a timeliness factor there, and there's a specificity there where we want to make sure that people are getting both the information and the resources that they then need to act on that information in collaboration. So I think then when it comes to what that means for our own interventions, you know, it's something that we're really thinking about from the Internews side, where we really focus on that information piece, but how can we be collaborating and partnering and working with those institutions and organizations, whether it's humanitarian, government, et cetera, that provide those resources, and same, that the information piece really needs to be integrated into these larger interventions. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Before we go to the third question for the audience, Celso or Jennifer, would you like to add anything on this point, particularly the point raised by Lea, as you both are operational actors, so those providing the resources? Is there any feedback on this point?
Yes, I'm happy to give it a go. Very, very interesting to see the answers in the Mentimeter. I kind of want to, yes, I want to react on the fact that many people seem to have mentioned simplicity, accessibility of the information, and that's what I can really relate to. I think to answer the question, definitely a higher level of coordination and collaboration between humanitarian partners and national, local stakeholders would be needed on data sharing, on agreeing about what is the information that we need. We've mentioned that many times, and on ensuring a minimum level of harmonization in terms of collection and analysis of the climate data. And just an example from the ground, speaking from my own organization's experience, as part of the Anticipatory Action Project I was mentioning earlier, we've analyzed data on climate vulnerabilities at community level from secondary and primary sources to inform the design of early action protocols. And it's been really an overwhelming process. We've seen firsthand how the data is scattered between multiple agencies, be it the national disaster management agencies, statistical agencies, social protection programs, humanitarian agencies, private companies developing impact-based models. So it can be really an overwhelming process, and I so understand this need for simplicity, having the information accessible and actionable, because it's really a puzzle to piece together. There is a multiplicity of sources out there, but each with a specific bit of the information, so it's difficult to have a comprehensive overview of climate vulnerabilities and risks, to anticipate the potential impacts on vulnerable groups, and to make informed decisions accordingly. So yeah, continuous advocacy is needed for increased collaboration, coordination, and obviously supporting locally led processes and capacity to generate, analyze, and use climate data. And this entails, I think, increased funding, obviously, for data collection and analysis, building capacity, involving local actors in any humanitarian activities dealing with generating, collecting climate data, and technological support. I think we've mentioned it, but setting up information platforms accessible for a diversity of stakeholders, having products with actionable information in them. So I'll stop there. I could go on and on, but it is a challenge. I don't have all the answers, certainly not. Just some areas for improvement to be explored.
Thank you, Jennifer. Jeremy, please. Or perhaps also you'd like to add anything on?
Just to add,
Yeah.
just add quickly that I share. I mean, we must not lose sight. We must not lose sight of for whom we are doing these things, for the most vulnerable, and the key for them to access to be able to access information, to be able to benefit from the availability of information is the key. Again, I share the concern about making things simple, simplicity. If we make things too much complicated, this won't be useful for the communities, for the households, for the populations that will be needing the most. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Jeremy.
Thanks a lot, and I think it's the words that came out, and I think the reflection kind of converges towards the point of trying, going back to really connecting this kind of scientific data and local knowledge. I think we've unfortunately kind of created a false dichotomy that these are two fundamentally different things, but local knowledge is actually based on empirical evidence, empirical observations, right? And so just reflecting on those two key words, accessible and actionable, I'm not a big fan of data platforms. I've seen too many fail in the risk ecosystem. I'm a big fan of communicating with communities, with stakeholders, and I can't stress, as you know, I've done a lot of risk maps, nice risk maps, and then you take it to a mayor or a local community, and they will destroy those maps, right? Because either they're not accurate, or some of the information is not accurate. But creating that link, creating that ecosystem, and it links to your data information ecosystems reflection is critical, and that's where I think bringing together geospatial data, qualitative data, community feedback into processes in which we, communities, risk practitioners or humanitarian practitioners can come together and co-construct what are the priorities. And I think this goes back to Kelly's questions that at the local level, people don't care whether it's humanitarian development funding. These are our silos, right? A mayor has to deal with extreme heat, let's say, and has to deal with IDP arrivals. They don't care what's the resources that come and how they come. And so I guess that the importance is really tracking, what are the specific information needs, connecting the scientific data, being there with those communities, really, like, even data scientists don't know where to access the latest data platforms, right? Like, And I think that's where the operational footprint being with the communities is key, and really reflecting on the role of humanitarian actors within this kind of climate risk and ecosystem. More often than not, the only actors that are present in the kind of fragile conflict, it's the humanitarians. And JFDR and the World Bank has been doing a lot over the last few years in terms of increasing their footprint in FCV context, in fragile and conflict and violent setting context. But very often we don't see the bank and the development actors in the subnational capitals, right? They'll be very good at working with ministries and state structures, but at the local level, very often it's the humanitarians that are there. So I had a few examples to share of how we try to do this through data, but I think I'm going to keep it there. But it's very much about understanding risk at local level to bring actors together and find and co-create common solutions, basically.
Thank you very much. So we will now show the third and last question for the audience. How can we ensure climate data and analysis become accessible, inclusive for local actors? Question is a complex one. We're looking at how we can ensure that we target. I mean, that really resonates with what Lea mentioned before, how we can target local actors when we write analysis, all the analysis platforms online, in one button you have it all. These are designed for decision makers in Brussels, London, but I'm not sure that people designing them have local decision makers in mind as one of the audience. And the other point is how we can make information generation including local actors. How can they contribute through the local knowledge, which is empirical, yes, to the generation of information. So yeah, talk to them, very good point, followed by simplification, absolutely. Yeah, someone mentioning social media and the role of local media and social media is quite crucial. Translation. Yeah. It's true, we often consider that, particularly if we don't have a very close presence in countries, the local actors, ecosystems, is too complex and overwhelming to navigate. But there are networks we can build on. Yeah. Partners, not recipient. This is, and I think a lot of these points are very much in line with the principles of locally led adaptation, localization as well. A significant shift in power relation. Okay. Take one more minute, and then we'll. So as we still have answers, perhaps. Celso, you would like to start sharing your experience on this point.
Yes, thank you. First of all, I would like to refer back to the earlier question about what is local.
Yeah.
For us, at least for us, local means anything that is not international, it's local. Meaning we deal with national government authorities, we deal with local governments, we deal with communities, we deal at the lower administrative level, we deal with groups, civil society organizations, and so on. So this is what we consider as local. Of course, there are differences, there are gradations between, say, for example, the different administrative levels. The local government authority and the subnational and the national authorities. We also have to make that distinction. And we need to also be very clear about who among these locals would need the most support, would need the most support in terms of capacity building, resilience building, and so on. So, and then let me backtrack a bit in terms of local capacity building. Since 2007, CARE has been working with households, with communities, with local government units, and necessarily we also have to work with national government agencies in resilience building capacities. And through these resilience capacity building activities, programs, the partners that we have are able to address issues about access and access and use of climate data and analysis. But I have to qualify that. Yes, they are able to access climate data and analysis, but to a certain extent. There are still many barriers that local actors face in terms of accessing and making use of climate data and analysis. And the earlier comment about the divide between hard science and social science resonates very well with us. We believe that there is an unnecessary emphasis on putting a distinction, an artificial divide between rocket science. I have to rephrase that. Quote, rocket science, unquote, and social science, because it does not create an environment that is very conducive for communities, for local actors to be able to access information and make use of the information to the best of their interests. So this is one of the issues that we are raising in different advocacy platforms, especially in anticipatory action platforms where there is so much emphasis on rocket science, to the extent that many of the most affected communities, most high-risk communities are excluded or have the tendency to be excluded from humanitarian actions because of this too much emphasis on rocket science. And the second point, is that, as I have raised earlier, how do we identify amongst the different local actors that we work with? How do we prioritize? How do we prioritize the local, the towns, the municipalities, the communities, and the households that we work with in terms of capacity building? So it's really going back to the basic of identifying the most vulnerable and working with them, building their capacities. So for us, here there are two recommendations. One is to go back to the basic of being very clear on who we work with, and that means we work with the most vulnerable, most affected, last mile communities, and then we also advocate for erasing the artificial divide between soft science and hard science. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Celso. Jennifer.
Yes, I think Celso brilliantly answered. I couldn't agree more. I agree that I think there is no one-size-fits-all approach because, as Celso was saying, there is a range of local actors, and disaster risk and climate governance happens at multiple levels. We can work with disaster management committees at the community level with households all the way up to the National Bureau of Disaster Risk Reduction. So I agree that there's a need to clarify who are the local actors we work with, that specific strategies might work for certain levels. But for instance, I think the general principle, regardless of the nature of the actor, is really to try to uphold our commitment to the localization agenda, meaning placing the local actor, regardless of its nature, at the heart of the decision-making process. And for instance, if you work at the community level, this would mean using participatory and inclusive approaches to assessing local vulnerability and capacities with the participation of all community members, and supporting the solutions that come up from these community exercises. If you engage with subnational or national level actors, then it means really making sure that they are involved and participate meaningfully in any strategic planning, strategic decisions around disaster risk and climate governance at the scale of their country or province or region. So I think it's really about upholding the commitment to localization. And to go back to what Jeremy was saying before about how data platforms sometimes fail, I completely agree that it may not be the right solution for a very local level. But I guess that's what I mean when I say there is no one size fits all, is that obviously for a local community, you may want to simply work on a very local level early warning system accessible to all, making sure that the alerts reach everyone, even using low-tech solutions, but maybe at a higher level, you may need these types of more technological approaches. But again, this is something that would be, the need would be shared by local actors. So yeah, in a nutshell, going back to just talking to them, as someone was mentioning in the Mentimeter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer and Celso. We will now take a few questions or comments from the audience here in Geneva, and then we'll see if there is any question or comment. Please.
Yes, I'm Christine Bloch from the Jesuit Refugee Service. I don't know that I have any answers, but we've done some research in Indonesia and in Philippines with local communities that are at risk of being displaced by climate change. And basically, it's a mapping of the risk, it's a mapping of the most vulnerable, but then what it really is also empowering the communities themselves to be able to advocate for what they need. And I think that aspect is extremely important when we're talking about this. It's really about empowering local actors to be able to speak up about what they need, what information they need, what training they need, what government action they need, really. So just a little comment.
Thank you very much. Anyone else? Do we have any comments from the audience that we can?
Yeah, just a few comments online. Somebody says that translating climate analysis to local languages and disseminating them in the local communities can play a crucial role in rising awareness, preparedness, and prevention of the hazard, which I think echoes quite a lot of what we heard today. But I noticed that in the three that they mention here, the raising awareness, preparedness, and prevention, they don't mention response. So I'm wondering how does translating climate analysis to local languages and disseminating them into the local communities, how can that take place when it comes to kind of a response to a sudden onset with tight timelines, as Celso mentioned?
No. Yes, thank you. Perhaps Celso would like to comment on these 2 points. Jennifer as well, you've been working on anticipatory action in a few countries. Please, the floor is yours. Celso?
Yes,
Yes.
yes, let me start. I mentioned earlier about the rapid response mechanism where we have to uh, take action very quickly within the first 24 hours, within the first 48 hours, or even, if at all possible, take action even before the onset of a hazard event. And that means that you will have ready resources available already, so that you can respond quickly. And then it also takes some imagination. I would like to put it that way. It would take some imagination for us to be able to respond quickly because of the earlier um, concern I raised about the lack of timely information. So, given the lack of timely information, um, raise, for example, raise the awareness of the public, of the other humanitarian actors, of the donors about the situation. We have developed something like in place of because of the lack of data, we have developed something like um, making estimates about what would be the likely impact of how many people would be likely affected by uh, by by the hazard event. Like for example, it's a super typhoon. There is a category about municipalities being affected by uh, signal number 3, signal number 4, signal number 5 uh, um, wind speeds. So it gives an idea of the strength of the of the wind that will impact on the particular municipalities. And for those municipalities, we have information, total population about the households belonging to the poorer section of the population, number of households that have poor shelter conditions, and we make use of those information to estimate um, uh, which areas would most likely, which geographic locations would most likely need assistance, and then what would be the most likely, uh, what would be the most likely uh, pressing humanitarian need in those particular areas. So we deploy our rapid response. We deploy our teams to conduct rapid needs assessments, and at the same time already start initial response activities. The bottom line is that we need to come up with some solutions to address the question of lack of timely information that would impact on very important decisions and actions. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Celso. Jennifer, you would like to add anything on points raised by Celso and the audience?
Maybe just to say that I think we stress a lot preparedness, anticipatory action, because there's a general consensus about the fact that those processes and those approaches really help delivering timely responses, either before the worst impacts of a climate shock fully unfold or after the impact. So generally speaking, I think scenario planning, working on identifying a range of potential outcomes and impacts can really help design responses and can make us more reactive when the time comes. So I can only stress the need for investment in DRR, in anticipatory action, especially because the humanitarian system will not be able to keep up with escalating impact. So yeah, I can only stress that.
Thank you, Jennifer. Jeremy, any closing remark or comment?
Yeah, just a quick comment, and I think it speaks to a lot of the various conversations we've been having. I don't think the complexity lies so much in the data, the complexity lies in the relationship building it. And I think it talks to your point, Celso, that having those meaningful relationships in the field is very powerful in terms of actually having some impact. And the challenge of that is it takes a lot of time. Building meaningful relationships with local authorities takes time. And one example I wanted to share, it was in Ukraine. We'd been here for 2 years doing regular research. They said, hey, these guys are useful in terms of risk mapping, right? And then they had a major forest fire. They called us the same morning and they're just like, hey, can you help us now? We need like this forest fire mapping in 2 hours. And of course, what I said to my team is, do that map in 30 minutes, right? Because that's exactly what they need at that moment. But it took us 2 years to build those relationships at national level and local level. And I think as a concluding remark and really echoing a lot, it's take the time to build those meaningful relationships, because once you've got them, you'll be very much able to identify the need and be extremely relevant to those needs. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeremy. Leah?
I mean, I don't have a lot to add to that. Yeah. I think it really speaks to that point on trust, and that, we've certainly been talking a lot about trust this week in various sessions, and I think, it really investing in understanding what creates trust, what breaks it down, how can we rebuild it, I think is the same thing as what you're saying in terms of investing in those relationships.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for joining us today. Please take just a few minutes to fill a short survey, to give us feedback about the event. Thank you very much, and we'll see you soon. We have another ACAPS session this afternoon, focused on rapid anticipatory analysis and in climate change affected sectors. And we'll thank you very much. We'll see you soon.